We are witnessing a profound geopolitical dissonance defining our social landscape right now. We see this highly visible celebration of digital identity and reclaimed cultural narratives. But let's be absolutely clear about what is missing here: any recognition of adoptees, people whose lives are shaped entirely by forced or managed dislocation. We're opening this briefing to examine the architecture of this dislocation, because adoption, especially in its modern form, isn't just a personal story. It is a system that routinely severs identity, rewrites origin, and expects the individual to carry the weight of that fracture in silence. When we talk about identity and narrative power, we must confront the absolute reality of those whose lives are shaped by state-sponsored erasure. Here is the structure of this briefing. 1. The Seabling illusion. 2. The architecture of erasure. 3. The 5D split. 4. The mathematics of trauma. And 5. Post-tragic sovereignty. We will systematically dissect these empirical realities today.
Section 1. The Seabling illusion. Digital solidarity versus institutional dislocation. Right now, there's a highly visible phenomenon sweeping Southeast Asia. It's a coordinated networked solidarity rejecting a 2,000-year-old regional hierarchy. Let's look at the numbers. In early 2026, we tracked 10.8 million digital engagements. 10.8 million. This data catalyzed what is now known as the Seablings movement. Make no mistake, this was an undeniable grassroots insurrection turning everyday digital infrastructure into massive political mobilization. It was an entire region deciding collectively to assert its narrative sovereignty. But we have to confront a stark antithesis here. Solidarity simply cannot be built on a foundation of legal fictions. The rhetoric in this current conversation, all this talk about belonging, identity, and narrative control, well, it lands very differently when you've had those exact things legally stripped and reassigned. Narrative power is a complete illusion when a region deliberately ignores the structural machinery that institutionally rewrites the lives of its own displaced citizens. You see, reclaiming the so-called Asian story rings entirely hollow if we just overlook the people who had their own stories legally erased.
Section 2. The architecture of erasure. Identity as a commodity. Beneath these public digital alliances lies a hidden, systematic framework. A framework where human lives were literally harvested. We need to understand that identity was turned into a commodity for Western consumption, and it was entirely executed under the guise of rescue and benevolence.
We define this mechanism clinically as administrative identity laundering. What is that? It's the state-sponsored process of issuing falsified legal documents. We're talking about forged birth certificates that literally list adoptive parents as the biological progenitors. This isn't an accident. It is an established, deliberate method of state control designed to permanently sever origin and re-engineer a human identity for export.
And by legally voiding biological truth and sealing original records, the state commits permanent epistemicide. That means the systematic destruction of an individual's ways of knowing their own history. The state institutionalizes a lie. Think about the sheer weight of that for a moment. It's a permanent psychological and legal violence committed against its own people, stripping away a human being's fundamental tools of self-knowledge.
The scale of this machinery is absolutely staggering. 200,000, that's the number of Korean children alone processed through this system of erasure over 6 decades. Hundreds of thousands of human beings were frequently and legally declared orphans, despite the empirical, verifiable fact that they had known living parents.
The systemic nature of this abuse is irrefutable, and we can track it across 4 distinct drivers. First, cost-driven welfare. Adoption was prioritized as a cheap alternative to domestic support. Second, to maintain that high volume, expedited procedures completely bypassed legal verification and biological consent. Third, by delegating vast powers to private agencies with minimal oversight, the state effectively erased its own accountability. And finally, the direct result: administrative fraud. Records were routinely falsified. Children were falsely declared dead to their biological parents. Understand this. This was state-sponsored human trafficking.
This architecture engineers what we call the ontological closed loop. It's an existential trap. Adoptees don't get to just return to some stable sense of self or culture. They are trapped in a system that expects them to assimilate seamlessly. They are expected to perform gratitude and to carry the weight of that fracture in silence. They are implicitly told never to interrogate the conditions that made their displacement possible in the first place. They are forced to live inside a narrative entirely approved by the state, while their true origins remain legally voided.
Section 3. The 5D split. Living on 2 frequencies.
We now have to turn to the physiological and psychological reality of living inside this tension. And let's be clear, adoptees live inside that tension not as some abstract academic idea, but as a lifelong, visceral fracture caused directly by state-sponsored dislocation.
These individuals are forced to exist across two asynchronous and conflicting signals. On one side, there's the high adaptive frequency. This is the socially approved identity assigned by the state and the adoptive family. It requires a continuous, exhaustive performance of stability and gratitude. But beneath that sits the subsonic signal, the frequency of biological truth. It's the unyielding, constant pressure of an origin that was legally voided on paper but remains completely physiologically present in the body.
As we've established, identity here exists in superposition. We're looking at the quantum echoes of adoption. The original rupture of separation doesn't just go away, it reverberates across every single level of human existence. This trauma alters attachment circuitry pre-verbally. It fundamentally changes stress regulation on a molecular level. It creates a psychological dual reference identity. And all of this is enforced by the permanent legal erasure of sealed records. The individual is held constantly in superposition.
Section 4. The Mathematics of Trauma, the Global Reckoning. Look, the state can forge the documents, and it can seal the archives, but the human body keeps the score. We are now going to examine the uncompromising empirical validation of this trauma.
The quiet architecture of silence is finally fracturing. Just look at the rapid, undeniable legal implosions happening across Europe. In 2025 alone, Norway's directorate recommended a total suspension of adoptions due to deliberate cheating and document forgery. That same year, Sweden recommended a total ban, directly citing decades of child trafficking and kidnappings. We also saw activist Uma Feed launch a monumental lawsuit against the Norwegian state, forcefully exposing the reality that these transfers were state-sponsored crimes disguised as rescue. And following this cascade, in 2026, the data from the peer study provided mathematical, indisputable proof of the psychological toll.
I present to you the mathematical reality of the trauma inflicted upon the displaced. Adoptees are statistically 35 times more likely to attempt suicide than their non-adopted peers. 35 times. This data completely strips away the sanitized, benevolent language of the adoption industry and lays bare the absolute true cost of administrative erasure.
And we also have the metrics of the collateral destruction. First mothers are 37.7 times more likely to attempt suicide. This empirical reality completely shatters the deeply entrenched myth of the willing surrender. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the system extracts a devastating toll, resulting in a significantly lower life expectancy for the very women whose children were harvested.
Let there be absolute clarity on this point. The wound persists completely regardless of the love, the benevolence, or the financial resources of the adoptive home. This trauma is deeply rooted in the primal mother-child separation itself. It's a wound that is only deepened and compounded by the secrecy, the shame, and the engineered legal fictions of the adoption process.
Section 5. Post-tragic sovereignty, beyond the hashtag. If this current conversation about regional identity, digital solidarity, and reclaiming narrative power is actually serious about confronting erasure, then it must confront the entire system. True solidarity is absolutely impossible while overlooking the people whose identities were institutionally rewritten from the exact moment they were taken.
We must execute strategic imperatives to dismantle this closed loop. First, the displaced must build independent archives entirely outside of institutional control. Second, we have to track data convergence across thousands of accounts to fundamentally challenge and break those official state narratives. Third, there must be an uncompromising global demand for full access to original identity documents. And finally, we must forcefully separate biological truth from state-engineered legal fictions.
This leaves us with a final, uncompromising reality. When people talk about identity, unity, or reclaiming narrative power, it raises a much harder question. If a region claims to reclaim its narrative, yet completely ignores the state-sponsored erasure of its own children, who actually gets to define identity, and who has it defined for them? True healing does not come from performing gratitude, and it certainly doesn't come from assimilating into a lie. True healing demands building post-tragic sovereignty in the exact space of the rupture.